The harsh Arizona sun beat down on Sarah Holloway's raw, blistered hands as she hoisted another log into place. Alone on the barren mesa, miles from civilization, she had nothing but determination and the tools her late father left behind. 3. Weeks of backbreaking labor had yielded walls barely chest-high. Each night, she collapsed onto her bedroll, body aching, yet rose with the dawn to continue. From the shadow of a distant ridge, watchful eyes had been following her progress. The Apache scout Tł'éé had seen white settlers before, but never one who worked the land with such respect and perseverance. What would happen when these two worlds, divided by blood and history, finally collided? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Holloway ran her fingers over the official land deed, the harsh red, rejected stamp, still seeming wet to her touch, though it had been 6 months since Judge Hammond had slammed it onto the paper. 6 months since her world had collapsed. "Miss Holloway," the judge had drawled, peering down from his bench with thinly veiled contempt. "A single woman has no business claiming frontier land. The territory needs families, men who can work the soil properly." She remembered standing there in her best dress, the one she'd sewn herself from flour sacks, trembling not with fear, but with fury. "That valley belonged to my father. He worked it for 3 years before the fever took him." The judge had barely glanced at the documentation she'd brought. Her father's original claim, the improvements recorded, the taxes paid. Instead, he'd shuffled the papers into a neat stack and handed them to his clerk. "The claim has been awarded to Mr. Emmett Price," he announced, nodding toward his nephew, who sat smugly in the corner of the courtroom. "A man with a proper family and proper means to develop the land." That night, Sarah had climbed to the mesa, above their valley homestead, a place her father had always called too stubborn to be worth a damn. She'd stood at its edge, watching as Emmett Price's men began dismantling the home she'd shared with her father. They were already cutting down the apple trees her father had nurtured for 3 seasons. "I won't cry," she'd whispered to the stars, her father's worn leather gloves clutched in her hands. "Crying doesn't build anything." With the few coins she'd saved from selling eggs and butter in town, Sarah purchased supplies: an axe, a saw, nails, rope, a hammer. The shopkeeper had raised his eyebrows when she'd laid out her list. "Building. Something, Miss Holloway?" "A life," she'd answered simply. That first night on the mesa had been terrifying. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind whipped mercilessly across the exposed tableland. Sarah had huddled beneath her father's old army coat, sleeping under the vast canopy of stars. By morning, her fear had hardened into resolution. "I'll make something of this place, Pa," she'd promised, pulling on his gloves, though they swallowed her hands. "Something they can't take away." Day by day, she learned. Her first attempts at felling trees had been clumsy, dangerous. She'd nearly crushed herself twice before understanding the proper technique. Hauling the logs had been another challenge altogether, her slight frame struggling against the immense weight, until she'd devised a system of pulleys and leverage her father had once described from his logging days in Oregon. The solitude was both blessing and curse. No one to help, but no one to tell her it couldn't be done. No one to comfort her when she collapsed in exhaustion, but no one to witness her tears of frustration when a day's work had to be redone. She kept her father's gloves even as they grew soft and worn with her labor. Sometimes at night she would trace her fingers over the leather, feeling the imprint of his hands, larger, stronger hands that had nevertheless taught hers to be capable. "You're a Holloway," he'd always told her. "Holloways make their own way." Now, standing on the mesa with walls that reached her chest, Sarah Holloway had begun to prove him right. The valley below might belong to Judge Hammond's nephew, with its fertile soil and flowing creek, but this harsh, unforgiving mesa would belong to her, if she could tame it, if she could endure. She slipped her father's gloves back on, ignoring the blisters beneath. The sun was climbing, and there was work to be done. Each morning began the same way. Sarah would wake before dawn, her body protesting every movement. She'd sit up from her bedroll, massage her aching shoulders, and reach for the small leather-bound journal beside her. By candlelight, she'd record the previous day's progress, sketch the next section of construction, and remind herself why this mattered. The journal had been a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. For a girl with too many ideas to keep in her head, he'd said with a wink. Now at 23, those pages contained her survival plan. Today's entry was brief. Walls, now chest-high on all sides. Need 5 more logs minimum for proper height. Hands healing slowly. She tucked the journal away and began her day. First, the fire to boil coffee, a luxury she permitted herself only because her father had insisted coffee was thinking fuel. As the water heated, Sarah stretched her muscles methodically. A routine she'd developed after the first week of agony had taught her that unprepared bodies break easily. The sunrise painted the mesa in gold and amber as she selected her tree for the day. She'd learned to be selective. Not too green, not too dry, straight enough to stack properly. This one was a ponderosa pine, not ideal but workable. She circled it, planning her cuts, visualizing its fall path. "Morning, friend," she murmured, placing her palm against the rough bark. "I need your strength today." The rhythmic swing of the axe had become almost meditative. Chip, chip, swing, chip, chip, swing. Her technique had improved dramatically. What once took hours now required less than one. The tree gave a telltale, a crack, and Sarah stepped back, watching with satisfaction as it fell precisely where she'd intended. Stripping bark was tedious work. Sarah had fashioned a drawing knife from an old wagon spring, and it served well enough, though her hands blistered anew with each use. She'd learned to position the logs on a slight incline, using gravity to assist as she dragged the tool across the surface, revealing the pale flesh beneath the rough exterior. "Well, looky here, boys, a regular lady lumberjack." The voices startled her. 3 men on horseback had approached without her noticing, too absorbed in her work. "Ma'am, you lost?" the lead rider asked, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy that didn't match his mocking eyes. "I'm exactly where I intend to be," Sarah replied, continuing her work without looking up. "All alone up here. Building. What exactly?" Another rider circled around, eyeing her partially constructed walls. A home. The men exchanged glances, poorly concealed smirks passing between them. "No man to help you? Seems mighty peculiar." Sarah finally stopped, standing straight and meeting their eyes directly. "Is there something you need, gentlemen? I've got daylight to use." The lead rider shrugged. "Just passing through. Didn't expect to see a woman playing carpenter. Won't last the winter up here if you ask me." "I didn't ask," Sarah said simply, returning to her work. They lingered a moment longer before continuing on, their laughter drifting back to her. It wasn't the first such encounter, nor would it be the last. Each time, the words stung less. By midday, the log was stripped and ready for hauling. Sarah had rigged an ingenious system of pulleys anchored to the sturdiest trees, allowing her to move weights that should have been impossible for her frame. She'd sketched the system in her journal first, recalling her father's explanations of mechanical advantage. The sun climbed higher as she worked, her muscles developing a familiar burn. The first few weeks, she'd collapsed by noon, her body unused to such labor. Now she worked through the pain, recognizing it as the feeling of becoming stronger. Evening found her adding the day's log to the wall, carefully notching the ends to interlock with the existing structure. Her father had taught her this technique years ago, when they'd built a storage shed together. "Logs want to roll," he'd explained. "Your job is to convince them to stay put." As darkness fell, Sarah lit her small lamp and opened her journal once more. She sketched the day's progress, noting where improvements could be made. In the margins, she added, "Arms stronger today. Managed the pulley with less strain. Tomorrow, the roof begins." Sarah closed the journal and ran her fingers over its worn cover. In its pages lay not just construction plans, but her transformation from the judge's single woman with no business to someone who could build a life with her own two hands. Tł'éé moved like a shadow across the rugged terrain, his moccasined feet finding purchase where others would stumble. The eagle feather, secured in his hair, shifted slightly with the breeze, a talisman of clear vision given to him by his father when he became a scout for the people. As boundary scout for the ND, what the white men called Apache, Tł'éé's responsibility was to monitor encroachments on their ancestral lands. For 3 generations, an uneasy peace had held in this region, maintained by vigilance and careful distance. He crouched at the ridgeline, observing the solitary figure below. For nearly 2 weeks, he had watched the white woman's determined effort. At first, he had come to assess the threat. Another settler meant more to follow, but something about her solitude, her method, had kept him returning day after day. "You watch the sun-hair woman again." The voice behind him belonged to Nantai, a younger scout who occasionally accompanied Tł'éé on his patrols. "She works differently than the others," Tł'éé replied without turning. "No men, no wagons of supplies, just her hands and simple tools." Nantai settled beside him, squinting down at the distant figure. "One white settler or many, does it matter? They bring more, always more." Tł'éé fingered the eagle feather, remembering his father's words when he'd presented it. "To see clearly, you must look beyond what you expect to find." "This one is different," he said finally. "She doesn't tear the earth with iron plows. She uses what the land offers. The elders will want to know about any settler." Nantai's tone carried warning, even one woman alone. That evening, Tł'éé sat in council with the tribal elders in their camp several miles from the mesa. He had reported his findings with careful precision: the woman's location, her building technique, her apparent solitude. "A woman alone cannot survive the winter," said Tł'éé, the eldest of the council. "The problem will solve itself." "Unless more settlers join her," countered Nantai, whose face bore the scars of past conflicts with blue-coat soldiers. "One becomes many. Many become towns. Towns become forts." The debate continued as firelight flickered across weathered faces. Tł'éé listened respectfully, though his thoughts kept returning to the woman's hands, raw, bleeding, yet persistently working. There was something in her determination that reminded him of his own grandmother, who had rebuilt their family shelter alone after raiders had burned it years ago. "What do you see in this woman, Tł'éé?" The question came from Bitse, the medicine woman whose judgment was most respected among the council. Tł'éé chose his words carefully. "I see someone who respects the labor of building. She does not command others to work. She does not destroy more than she needs. He hesitated, knowing his next words might seem strange. "She speaks to the trees before she cuts them." A murmur rippled through the council. Speaking to the elements of nature was a practice of the people, not of the white settlers who typically treated the land as something to be conquered. "You have been given the eagle's sight for a reason," Bitse said finally. "Continue to watch this woman. Learn her purpose. If others join her, we must know quickly." As the council dispersed, Nantai approached Tł'éé privately. "I remember when your father was killed by white settlers," he said bluntly. "Do not let one woman's struggle blind you to what her people bring." Tł'éé nodded respectfully but made no reply. The memory of his father's death at the hands of drunk settlers 20 years earlier remained a wound that had never fully healed. Yet he had also known kindness from whites, the trader who had taught him English, the doctor who had saved his sister's life during the fever season. Before dawn the next morning, Tł'éé returned to his observation point, the eagle feather, secure in his hair. Below, the woman was already working, her movements more practiced than when he had first observed her. "Show me who you truly are," he whispered, though she was far too distant to hear. "Show me if the people should fear you or not." The crack was sudden and devastating, a sound Sarah had come to fear above all others. The axe handle split cleanly, the metal head falling to the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo her sinking heart. She stood frozen, staring at the useless wooden stub still clutched in her hand. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." The axe had been her father's, the one tool she couldn't afford to replace. Without it, there would be no more logs, no walls, no roof, no home. Sarah sank to her knees beside the fallen tool, her shoulders slumping under the weight of this new setback. 5 weeks of backbreaking labor had pushed her body to its limits. Her hands, once smooth and capable at needlework, were now a map of calluses and half-healed cuts. Her arms ached constantly, and a persistent pain had settled in. Her lower back, but until now progress had been steady. The cabin walls stood nearly complete, a testament to her stubborn refusal to surrender. Just 3 more days of work would have seen the roof beams in place. "What would you do, Pa?" she asked the empty air, picking up the axe head and running, her thumb along its worn edge. The answer came in memory, her mother's voice from long ago when drought had killed their crops in Kansas. "We start again," Eleanor Holloway had said simply, rolling up her sleeves. "We always start again." Sarah wiped her face with a grimy sleeve and took inventory of her options. She could attempt to repair the handle with the rawhide she'd been saving for hinges. She could try to fashion a new handle from green wood, though it would likely break again quickly. Or she could make the half-day journey to town, facing ridicule and likely extortion from the shopkeeper who'd already overcharged her once. As the day's light began to fade, Sarah made her decision. She would sleep now and leave for town at first. Light. The trip would cost her a precious day of work, but there was no alternative. That night, the skies opened. Rain, rare in this season, poured in relentless sheets across the mesa. Sarah huddled beneath the partial roof she'd managed to construct over one corner of the cabin. The tarred canvas kept most of the water at bay, but by midnight her bedroll was soaked through. Cold seeped into her bones as the temperature dropped. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, trying to conserve warmth, knowing that getting chilled meant losing more workdays to illness. Her father had succumbed to pneumonia after a similar drenching, a memory that now brought fresh fear alongside grief. Lightning illuminated the skeletal frame of her unfinished home in harsh white flashes. Each thunderclap seemed to mock her efforts, the elements conspiring to drive her back to proper society and women's work. "I won't go back," she said through chattering teeth. "I won't give them the satisfaction." By dawn, the rain had stopped, but Sarah's body burned with fever. She forced herself to rise, knowing that movement was essential, but her limbs felt leaden. The world tilted alarmingly as she attempted to gather her few supplies for the journey. "To town. Just 1 foot," she muttered. Then the other. She managed 3 steps before her knees buckled. The ground rose to meet her with alarming speed, and the last thing she saw was the broken axe handle, still lying where she'd dropped it the day before. From his vantage point on the ridge, Tł'éé watched the woman collapse. He had observed her setback the previous day, the broken tool, her obvious despair. The night storm had concerned him, knowing the cabin's roof remained incomplete. Now, seeing her crumpled form beside the unfinished shelter, he made a decision that would alter both their paths irrevocably. The elders had instructed him to watch, not to interfere. But something about this woman's solitary struggle spoke to a deeper truth he recognized, the universal will to create a place of belonging. Tł'éé descended from his observation point, moving with deliberate care toward the cabin and the unconscious woman who had fought so hard to build it. Sarah woke to the sound of chopping, rhythmic, precise, the familiar bite of an axe into wood. For a moment, she thought she was a child again, listening to her father work outside their Kansas homestead. Then reality rushed back, the mesa, her cabin, the broken handle. She bolted, upright, immediately regretting the sudden movement as pain lanced through her head. The world spun briefly before settling. She was inside her unfinished cabin, lying on her bedroll, which was now mysteriously dry. A small fire burned in a carefully constructed stone circle near the open wall, and the chopping continued. Sarah crawled to the edge of the wall and peered out. A man, not white, she realized immediately, was splitting logs with practiced efficiency. He used her axe, but the handle was new, expertly shaped from hardwood, an Apache. His long hair was pulled back, revealing sharp features and skin weathered by sun and wind. He worked with fluid grace, each movement purposeful and economical. Fear and confusion warred within her. Stories of Apache raids had circulated through settlements for years, though her father had always maintained that most tales were exaggerated by those who coveted Indian lands. The man suddenly paused, as if sensing her gaze. He turned toward the cabin, his dark eyes finding hers immediately. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another across the distance. Then he returned to his work, seemingly unconcerned by her observation. Sarah retreated into the cabin's shadow, her mind racing. Why would an Apache repair her axe? Why cut wood for her cabin? Was this some kind of trap? She took inventory of her situation. Her hunting knife was still in its sheath by her bedroll. Her father's rifle remained hidden beneath the floorboards she'd managed to lay. But weakness from her fever made the idea of confrontation foolish. When the chopping stopped, Sarah tensed. Footsteps approached, then stopped respectfully several paces from the cabin opening. "You have fever," came a voice, the English accented but clear. "Need water." A water skin appeared, placed on the ground, before retreating steps carried the man back to a distance. Sarah's thirst overcame her caution. She crawled forward and took the water skin, drinking deeply before sitting back against the cabin wall. Exposed but upright, she studied the man who now sat cross-legged on the ground, watching her with equal intensity. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice raspy from illness. He considered her question, his expression unreadable. "You build alone, with respect." He gestured toward the notched logs of her cabin. "Good work, strong. I'm Sarah Holloway." He nodded but offered no name in return. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small bundle of dried herbs. "For fever," he explained, placing it on the ground between them. "Make tea." Sarah eyed the bundle skeptically. "How do I know it's not poison?" Something flashed in his eyes, amusement perhaps. "If I want you dead, no need for poison." The simple logic was irrefutable. He had found her unconscious after all. "Thank you for fixing my axe," she said, changing direction. "I couldn't afford to replace it." He nodded again. "Good tool. Deserves good handle." A silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Sarah's gaze fell on a deep, puckered scar that ran along his forearm. "You've been watching me," she said suddenly, the realization dawning. "From the ridge. For weeks." His expression remained impassive, but he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Why? My duty. Watch boundaries." He gestured broadly toward the surrounding landscape. "This place, important to my people." "I'm not trying to steal anything," Sarah said quickly. "The valley below was my father's land, but they took it when he died. This mesa was all that was left." Interest flickered in his eyes. "They took your land?" "Men with papers and laws that only work for other men," she replied bitterly. Understanding passed between them then, a recognition of shared experience despite vastly different worlds. The Apache stood in one fluid motion. "Rest. Take medicine." He pointed to the herb bundle. "We'll return tomorrow." "Wait," Sarah called as he turned to leave. "What should I call you?" He paused, seeming to deliberate. "Tł'éé," he finally said. "It means silent wind." With that, he disappeared into the growing dusk, leaving Sarah with a repaired axe, cut wood, and a small bundle of herbs that represented the first help she had received in months. Consciousness returned to Sarah slowly, like wading through deep water toward distant light. Her fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like days. Sunlight filtered through the cabin's open side, casting patterns across the dirt floor. She wasn't alone. Tł'éé sat nearby, his back against the wall, whittling a piece of wood with practiced strokes. A clay bowl with intricate markings sat beside him, filled with water that caught the sunlight. "How long?" Sarah's voice was a dry croak. Tł'éé looked up, his expression revealing a flicker of relief. "3 suns," he replied, setting aside his carving to offer her the clay bowl. "Drink slowly." 3 days. Sarah had lost 3 precious days to fever. She accepted the bowl with shaking hands, noticing unfamiliar symbols etched into its surface, concentric circles and flowing lines that somehow suggested flowing water. The water tasted different, sweeter and more mineral-rich than what she'd been drinking from her rain barrel. "Spring water," Tł'éé explained, seeing her surprise. "Special place, good medicine." Sarah drank carefully, then handed back the bowl. "You stayed?" It wasn't a question, but Tł'éé nodded anyway. "Fever spirits are strong enemies. Need guardian." The idea that this man, this stranger from a people she'd been taught to fear, had watched over her through days of illness was difficult to process. More difficult still was the realization that without his intervention, she likely would have died, alone and unremembered on this barren mesa. "Thank you," she said simply. The words felt inadequate. Tł'éé acknowledged her thanks with a slight inclination of his head. "You are strong. Fever spirits fought hard, but you fought harder." Sarah noticed changes to the cabin. The walls had been completed on all sides, and rough roof beams spanned the top, covered with canvas to keep out rain. He had continued her work while she was ill. "You didn't have to do this," she said, gesturing. "Do the improvements. A home needs walls. Winter comes soon." His practical tone suggested he saw nothing extraordinary in his actions. Sarah tried to stand, determined to resume her work, but dizziness forced her back down. Tł'éé watched without comment, then reached for a small pouch. "Eat," he said, offering her dried meat and what looked like crushed berries mixed with nuts. Strength returns with food. The dried meat was unlike any jerky she'd tasted, spiced with unfamiliar herbs that tingled pleasantly on her tongue. The berry mixture provided a burst of energy that seemed to clear the remaining fog from her mind. "There is a spring nearby?" she asked, remembering the water. Tł'éé nodded. "Hidden, not far, good water all seasons." "I didn't know," Sarah admitted. "I've been using rainwater and making trips to the creek below." Something like surprise crossed Tł'éé's features. "Creek water is," he searched for the word, "unreliable. Spring water is gift from earth." Sarah studied the clay bowl again. "Did you make this?" "Yes, for medicine water." He pointed to the symbols. "These speak to the water, remind it of its purpose to heal." In her previous life, Sarah might have dismissed such talk as superstition. But after days of benefiting from his knowledge, skepticism seemed both foolish and ungrateful. "Will you show me this spring?" she asked. "When you are stronger." Tł'éé rose in a fluid motion. "Tomorrow, perhaps." The next morning, Sarah awoke, feeling more like herself. Tł'éé had disappeared during the night, but returned at dawn with fresh game, a rabbit already skinned and ready for cooking. After a strengthening meal, he led her along a narrow path through scrub brush that she'd passed countless times without notice. They walked for nearly 20 minutes before reaching a cluster of rocks that appeared ordinary to Sarah's untrained eye. Tł'éé moved several stones in a specific pattern, revealing a small but steady flow of clear water emerging from the earth. He knelt beside it, cupping his hands to catch the flow before offering it to Sarah. "The people have known this spring for many generations," he explained. "Water beneath earth stays clean, cool in summer, unfrozen in winter." Sarah drank from his cupped hands, the intimacy of the gesture not lost on her. The water tasted even better here at its source. "All this time," she marveled. "I never knew it was here." "Many things hidden," Tł'éé replied, his dark eyes meeting hers, "until someone shows you how to see." "This is Pine Pitch," Tł'éé explained, pointing to a sticky amber substance oozing from a tree. Mix with ash, beeswax, makes strong seal for roof, keeps water out. Sarah ran her finger along the resin, feeling its tackiness. My father used tar paper when we could afford it. This better, lasts longer, smells better too. A hint of humour. Cross Tł'éé's usually stoic features. Over the past week, Sarah's strength had returned, and with it, a new phase of her education had begun. Tł'éé had appointed himself her guide to the mesa's hidden resources, revealing a landscape far richer than she had initially perceived. The land provides everything needed, he told her, if you know where to look. Today, they were gathering materials for the cabin's roof and walls. Sarah carried a rough hide bag that grew increasingly heavy with clay deposits, plant fibers, and pine resin. Tł'éé moved with quiet confidence through terrain she'd found forbidding, revealing food, medicine, and building materials at every turn. How do you remember all of this? Sarah asked as he identified yet another useful plant. Tł'éé tapped his head. Map here, stories here. Then he touched his chest. Knowledge here, passed from grandparents, parents, many generations. He paused, kneeling to unroll a piece of hide from his pouch. On it, he had drawn an intricate map of the mesa and surrounding valleys. Unlike the rectangular grid map Sarah was familiar with, this one flowed organically, marking resources rather than property lines. I make this for you, he said, pointing to symbols she didn't recognize. Water, food, medicine, building materials. Sarah studied the map with wonder. Her cabin sat at the center, marked with a simple square. Around it, concentric circles indicated walking distances, filled with detailed symbols. What does this mean? She asked, pointing to a mark near the spring. Clay, good for sealing, making bowls. He pointed to another symbol. This plant stops bleeding. This one, his finger moved again, good for stomach sickness. Some markings were labeled with careful English words beside Apache symbols, Tł'éé's handwriting surprisingly neat and precise. You speak English very well, Sarah observed. A shadow passed over his face. Learned at mission school. 2 years there, not good memories. Sarah sensed a painful history and didn't press. Instead, she asked, could you teach me some of your language? Surprise flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by careful consideration. Why? Because I'm living on your people's land, she said simply. I should at least know its proper names. Tł'éé studied her for a long moment before nodding. This, he gestured to the mesa around them, is Tł'éé, means rock with wings. Sarah attempted to repeat the phrase, her tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Tł'éé's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. Again, he instructed, listen first, Tł'éé. They practiced as they walked, Sarah repeating the names of plants, animals, and landmarks in his language. For each Apache word she attempted, Tł'éé would ask for the English equivalent, building his own vocabulary. By late afternoon, they had circled back toward the cabin, Sarah's bag full and her mind overflowing with new knowledge. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the mesa. Tomorrow I will show you hunting, Tł'éé said as they approached the cabin. Winter comes. Need meat. Sarah hesitated. I've never hunted before. My father did that. You build cabin alone, he replied with simple logic. You can learn to hunt. That evening, as they shared a meal of rabbit stew cooked with wild onions and herbs Tł'éé had gathered, Sarah studied the map he had given her. By firelight, she added her own notes in the margins, combining his knowledge with her observations. This will help me survive when... She stopped herself. When I am gone, Tł'éé finished, his expression unreadable. Will you leave soon? The question emerged more anxiously than she'd intended. Tł'éé stared into the fire. My people move. To winter grounds soon. I must join them. He glanced at the partially completed cabin. But not yet. Not until roof is finished. Sarah nodded, relief mingling with a new awareness that their time together had limits. She returned her attention to the map, memorizing each symbol, each location, preparing for a solitude that now seemed less appealing than before. "No, like this," Tł'éé demonstrated, his hands weaving supple willow branches in an intricate pattern. "Strength comes from weaving, not just stacking." Sarah watched intently before attempting to mimic his technique. Her first efforts were clumsy compared to his practiced motions, but by the third try, she began to grasp the method. They sat together on the cabin's newly completed floor, working on roof beams that would incorporate both Sarah's sturdy log framework and Tł'éé's flexible weaving technique. The combination created something neither had built before, stronger than either method alone. "My grandfather would say your cabin has good bones," Tł'éé remarked, inspecting their work. "But bones need sinew to move, to live. My father would say these weavings are fancy nonsense," Sarah replied with a small smile, "until he saw how well they worked." Tł'éé nodded, understanding. Old ways meet new ways. Both have wisdom. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's recovery, and the cabin had transformed with remarkable speed. What had once been a simple rectangle of log walls now featured a pitched roof framework, a proper stone hearth, and a floor raised off the ground to prevent dampness. Working together, they had established a rhythm. Sarah's knowledge of joinery and structural principles combined with Tł'éé's expertise in native materials and natural techniques. They rarely needed words now, anticipating each other's needs with growing familiarity. "In my village," Tł'éé said, as they fitted another woven beam into place, "we would have a ceremony when raising a new dwelling. Songs to make the home strong." "What kind of songs?" Sarah asked, securing the beam with a wooden peg. Tł'éé hesitated, then began a low, melodic chant in his language. The sound resonated through the cabin's wooden frame, rich and somehow perfect for the space. When he finished, the silence felt expectant. "That was beautiful," Sarah said softly. "What does it mean?" "It asks the spirits of the trees to remember they are still living, even in this new form, to stand strong against wind and rain." He ran his hand along the beam they'd just placed. "Wood remembers being tree. Stone remembers mountain. Good. Builder respects this memory." Sarah considered his words, finding unexpected truth in them. "I never thought of it that way. But I've always felt that materials have character. Some logs want to split certain ways. Some stones fit naturally together." "Yes," Tł'éé agreed, seeming pleased by her understanding. "You have builder's eyes." They worked until sunlight faded, completing the roof's main structure. The interwoven pattern of beams created a sturdy framework, unlike anything in the valley settlements below, neither fully Apache nor fully European in design. As they sat by the fire that evening, sharing a meal of venison from Tł'éé's morning, Sarah found herself laughing at his impression of her first attempt at throwing a hunting spear. "I wasn't that bad," she protested. "Fish in creek were laughing," he replied, his normally serious face creased with amusement. "Tomorrow I'll do better," she promised. "Yes, you learn quickly." His tone held genuine respect. A comfortable silence fell between them. Sarah studied the flames, aware of how dramatically her life had changed in the short time since Tł'éé had entered it. The cabin that had once seemed an impossible task was now nearly complete. The mesa that had appeared barren now revealed itself as a place of abundance through his teachings. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, voicing the question that had lingered unspoken between them. "That first day, when you found me sick, you could have left me." Tł'éé considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I watched you many days," he finally said. "You worked like my grandmother after raiders burned our family shelter. Alone, but not defeated. Spirit like that deserves to live." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Also," he added more quietly, "too many have died on this land already, both your people and mine." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of history that hung between them, a history neither of them had created, but both inherited. "We're building something different," she said, gesturing to the uniquely constructed roof beams above them. Tł'éé followed her gaze upward. "Yes," he agreed, "something new, something stronger." The crack of a branch snapping brought both Sarah and Tł'éé to immediate alertness. They had been working on sealing the roof with a mixture of pine pitch and clay, but now stood frozen, listening intently. "Horses," Tł'éé said quietly, already moving toward the edge of the clearing. 3, maybe 4. Before he could disappear into the brush, the riders emerged from the tree line. 3 men on horseback, led by a figure Sarah recognized with a sinking feeling, Emmett Price, Judge Hammond's nephew, who had claimed her father's valley property. "Well, look at what we have here," Price called out, his voice carrying false joviality. "Miss Holloway's gone native, it seems." The men behind him chuckled, their hands resting casually near their holstered pistols. Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Tł'éé, though he seemed more alert than afraid. "This is my property, Mr. Price," she said evenly. "What brings you all the way up here?" Price dismounted, his boots raising dust as he approached. He was a large man with a carefully groomed moustache and clothes too fine for frontier living, the mark of someone who had others do his physical labor. "Saw smoke from your chimney," he replied, eyeing the cabin with obvious surprise at its progress. "Folks in town were betting you'd have given up by now. Instead, we find you've taken up with a savage." The slur hung in the air. Sarah felt Tł'éé, tense beside her, but was impressed by his restraint. "Mr. Tł'éé has been kind enough to assist me with building techniques suited to this environment," she replied coldly. "Is there something specific you wanted, or did you ride all this way just to be unpleasant?" Price's smile tightened. "Actually, there's been some concern about safety in these parts. Apache raiding parties have been spotted near the Carson place." He glanced meaningfully at Tł'éé. "Wouldn't want anything to happen to a woman alone." "I'm quite safe," Sarah replied, "and those reports are likely exaggerated." "Are they?" Price stepped closer, lowering his voice, though not enough that his companions couldn't hear. "Because Judge Hammond received a letter just yesterday about increased Indian troubles. Armies sending additional troops to Fort Williams." Tł'éé's expression remained impassive, but Sarah sensed his concern at this news. "The mesa is peaceful," she insisted. "I've had no troubles." Price shook his head with exaggerated concern. "It's not proper, Miss Holloway. A woman alone with a—" He paused, eyes flicking to Tł'éé. "With company like this. Gives people ideas. What I do on my own property is no one's concern but mine." "Is it your property, though?" Price's voice took on a harder edge. "Judge Hammond mentioned some questions about your claim filing. Seems there might be some confusion about the boundaries." Sarah felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "There's no confusion. This mesa was excluded from my father's original claim because it was deemed worthless land at the time." "Things change," Price said with a shrug. "Anyway, we just came to check on you, being neighborly." He turned to leave, but stopped at the edge of the clearing. "Oh, almost forgot." He removed a folded paper from his jacket and nailed it to a nearby pine with a knife from his belt. "Just a friendly notice. Town meeting next week about the Indian problem." He looked directly at Tł'éé. "Some folks have strong opinions about savages being too close to civilized settlements." When the riders had disappeared down the trail, Sarah moved to the tree and removed the paper. It wasn't a meeting notice at all, but a crude warning. "No Indians or Indian lovers welcome. Civilized settlement only." She crumpled it in her fist, anger burning through her veins. "I'm sorry," she said to Tł'éé, who had remained silent throughout the encounter. "Not your words," he replied simply, though his eyes were troubled. "I should go, bring danger to you." "No," Sarah said firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They're trying to isolate me, make me vulnerable so I'll abandon this place." She gestured to the cabin they'd built together. "I won't let them win." Tł'éé studied her for a long moment. They will come back, with more men. Probably, Sarah agreed. Which means we need to finish the cabin sooner than we thought. Make it secure. She smoothed out the crumpled warning notice, her jaw set with determination. This changes nothing, except perhaps our timeline. Tł'éé nodded slowly, decision forming in his dark eyes. Then we work faster, and I will teach you more than just building. The stars do not belong to anyone, Tł'éé explained, pointing to the brilliant canopy above them. They are visitors, like dreams. Sarah and Tł'éé sat outside the nearly completed cabin, the night air cool but not uncomfortable. After a day of intense labor, reinforcing the cabin's walls and fashioning sturdy shutters for the windows, they had fallen into one of their evening conversations, moments of reflection that had become increasingly important to them both. "My father used to navigate by the stars," Sarah said, identifying the North Star with an outstretched finger. "He was in the cavalry before he became a settler, said a man who knows the stars is never truly lost." "Your father was wise," Tł'éé acknowledged. "My people call that one Polaris, same as yours. But that group," he traced a constellation, "we call Gar, the rabbit. What do your people name it?" "Cassiopeia, the queen," Sarah replied. "She was very beautiful but also boastful, so the gods punished her by placing her in the heavens." Tł'éé considered this. "Interesting. Our stories say Rabbit tricked Coyote and fled to the sky to escape punishment." He smiled slightly. "Both. Stories about consequences." Sarah drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Do your people believe the land belongs to anyone?" The question had been weighing on her since Price's visit. Tł'éé was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "We belong to the land," he finally said. "Not land to us. White man says, 'This is my land,' like he might say, 'This is my horse.' Apache says, 'I am of this place,' like he might say, 'I am of my mother.'" Sarah contemplated his words. "That's beautiful and very different from how I was raised to think. Your ways." Tł'éé chose his words carefully. "Draw many lines. This parcel, that parcel, this person owns, that person owns." "And those lines cause so much trouble," Sarah said quietly. From inside the cabin, she retrieved a small object she'd been working on in private moments, a carved wooden horse, its form simple but recognizable, with flowing mane and alert ears. She'd shaped it from pine with her hunting knife, working by firelight after Tł'éé had retired to his separate shelter. "I made this for you," she said, offering the carving. "It's not very good. My father was the real whittler in our family." Tł'éé accepted the gift with evident surprise, turning it over in his hands. "Horse spirit," he said appreciatively. "Strong medicine. My father said horses carried us into this new life," Sarah explained. "Without them, we couldn't have made the journey west." Tł'éé nodded. "My grandfather remembered time before horses came to our people. Said Apache became different after, stronger, faster. Horse changed us." He ran his thumb over the carved mane. "Good change, mostly. Do you have family waiting for you?" Sarah asked, the question emerging before she could reconsider its personal nature. If Tł'éé was surprised by her directness, he didn't show it. "My mother lives with my sister's family in winter camp. Father died long ago. White settlers. Drunk, looking for trouble." He stated this fact without visible emotion, though Sarah sensed the deep wound beneath his words. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Your family?" he asked after a moment. "All gone now. Mother died of fever when I was 14. Father raised me alone after that." Sarah gazed into the fire. "He taught me everything, how to read, how to build, how to stand my ground." "He taught well," Tł'éé observed. The compliment warmed her more than she expected. They sat in comfortable silence until Tł'éé spoke again. "Why do you stay here? Alone, fighting so hard?" Sarah considered the question. "At first it was spite," she admitted. "I wanted to prove Judge Hammond and his nephew wrong, show them. A woman could succeed where they said she'd fail. She paused, realizing something. But now I stay, because this feels like mine in a way nothing else has. Not because of a paper with my name, but because I've put my blood and sweat into every inch of it. Tł'éé nodded slowly. Now you understand Apache way a little. When we defend our hunting grounds, we are not defending papers with marks. We are defending our blood and sweat. Their eyes met across the fire, a moment of perfect understanding bridging their different worlds. The trading post at Miller's Crossing was unusually crowded for a Tuesday. Sarah moved cautiously through the throng, keeping her hat pulled low. She hadn't wanted to come to town at all, but they needed supplies she couldn't fashion or find on the mesa: nails, salt, coffee, and ammunition for her father's rifle. Conversations hushed as she approached the counter, then resumed in pointed whispers. Sarah ignored them, placing her list before Mr. Abernathy, the shopkeeper. "Been a while, Miss Holloway," he said, eyeing her sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. "Heard you've been busy up on that mesa." "Just the supplies, please," Sarah replied evenly. As Abernathy gathered her items, the door swung open and a cavalry officer entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. The whispers immediately ceased. "Lieutenant Blackwood," Abernathy called in greeting. "What brings you out from Fort Williams?" The officer nodded politely. "Official business, I'm afraid." He produced a letter bearing an official army seal. "Notice: for all settlements in the territory, there's been increased Apache activity near the Carson property and Richardson's mine." Sarah kept her expression neutral as the lieutenant continued. "All isolated homesteads are advised to exercise caution. Women and children should consider relocating to town until the situation stabilizes." He pinned the notice to the community board. "The army is increasing patrols, but we can't be everywhere at once." A stout farmer Sarah recognized from the valley spoke up. "Begging your pardon, Lieutenant, but some folks say the trouble started when Miss Holloway there took up with an Apache scout. Been building her cabin together, they have." All eyes turned to Sarah. Lieutenant Blackwood studied her with newfound interest. "Is that so, Miss Holloway?" she supplied, lifting her chin slightly. "And yes, I've had assistance with my cabin. From a local man who happens to be Apache. He's been nothing but respectful and helpful." The lieutenant frowned. "Miss Holloway, I strongly advise against fraternizing with natives during these unsettled times. Intelligence suggests renegade. Bands may be using friendly contacts to gather information about vulnerable homesteads." "That's absurd," Sarah replied, her temper flaring despite her attempt to remain calm. "Tł'éé has done nothing to—" "You even speak their language now," interrupted a woman near the back, her tone scandalized. Lieutenant Blackwood raised his hand for quiet. "Miss Holloway, I understand you're alone up there. Perhaps you should consider—" "I'm doing quite well on my own property, thank you," Sarah cut in. "And I'd appreciate if people would mind their own affairs." She paid for her supplies quickly and headed for the door, but the lieutenant followed her outside. "Miss Holloway, a word, please." Sarah paused reluctantly. "I served with a Captain Holloway in the 3rd Cavalry some years back," he said more quietly. "Good man. Your father?" "Yes," Sarah admitted, surprised. The lieutenant nodded. "Thought so. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble for you, but you should know, Judge Hammond has been pressuring the territorial office about that mesa land. Claims there might be mineral deposits worth surveying." Sarah's stomach tightened. "There's nothing up there but rock and scrub pine." "Maybe so," Blackwood agreed, "but gold rumors travel fast, and the judge has influence." He glanced around, before, continuing in a lower voice. "Your Apache friend, is he from the local band under Chief Nantai?" "I don't know," Sarah replied cautiously. "Well, if he is, you should know the Army's under orders to relocate that band to the northern reservation next month. Anyone resisting will be considered hostile." He held her gaze meaningfully. "Your father was a good officer and a fair man. I'd hate to see his daughter caught in something ugly." Sarah clutched her purchases tighter. "Thank you for the warning. Be careful." Miss Holloway, these times aren't kind to people who stand between worlds. As Sarah rode back toward the mesa, her mind raced. The lieutenant's warning, combined with Price's earlier threats, painted a clear picture. Forces were aligning against both her and Tł'éé, using fear of Indian troubles as convenient leverage. When she reached the cabin, Tł'éé was waiting, his expression grave. Before she could speak, he held up a leather message pouch with distinctive markings. "My people sent runner," he said simply. "Council wishes to speak with me, and with you. We must secure everything," Tł'éé said, his eyes scanning the western horizon where dark clouds gathered with unnatural speed. "This storm comes with angry spirits." Sarah had never seen him so concerned. All day the air had felt strange, too heavy, too still, as if the world were holding its breath. Now, as evening approached, the sky had transformed from clear blue to ominous purple-black within hours. "How bad will it be?" she asked, already moving to gather tools and supplies from around the cabin's exterior. "Worst kind, the kind that reshapes the land." Tł'éé was fastening additional supports to the newly completed roof. "In my language, we call it Niutso Niutshu, the wind that breaks mountains." They worked with urgent efficiency, their movements synchronized after weeks of building together. Sarah secured the window shutters while Tł'éé reinforced the door. The animals were brought into the small lean-to attached to the cabin, 2 goats Sarah had purchased in town, and the mule that carried her supplies. As the first massive droplets of rain began to fall, Tł'éé climbed to the roof one last time. Sarah watched with alarm as he carefully placed clay tiles along the peak, decorated pieces he had formed and fired days earlier but hadn't explained. "What are those?" she called over the rising wind. "Wind speakers," he replied, securing the last one. "They sing to the storm, ask it to pass gently." Under different circumstances, Sarah might have questioned such things, but the ferocity building in the sky silenced her skepticism. They retreated inside just as the full force of the storm arrived. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had experienced, not simply rain and wind, but a howling, living fury that seemed determined to erase their presence from the mesa. The cabin groaned and creaked under the onslaught, but the walls they had built together held firm. "The roof!" Sarah gasped as water began to seep through in one corner. Without hesitation, Tł'éé moved beneath the leak, reaching up to press a mixture of pine pitch and clay into the gap. Sarah quickly joined him, and together they worked to seal each breach as it appeared. Hours passed in this fashion, the storm's intensity never diminishing. Outside, they could hear trees snapping and debris slamming against the cabin walls. The small window overlooking the valley revealed nothing but darkness, broken by occasional blinding flashes of lightning. During one such flash, Sarah caught sight of Tł'éé's face, intense, focused, but with an expression that suggested he was listening to something beyond the storm's chaos. "What do you hear?" she asked during a brief lull. "The clay tiles," he replied. "They are singing with the wind." Sarah strained her ears and detected a strange, almost musical whistling from above, the wind passing through the specially shaped tiles on the roof's peak. "My grandmother taught me to make them," Tł'éé explained. "The shape catches the wind, turns anger into song. Whether by Apache magic or practical design, the tiles seemed to be working. Though the storm continued to rage, their roof remained mostly intact, the clay tiles directing the worst of the wind around rather than against the structure. By midnight, exhaustion overtook them both. They sat with backs against the most solid wall, occasionally rising to address new leaks but mostly conserving strength. "I've never seen a storm like this," Sarah said, her voice nearly lost in the tempest. "Many years since the last one," Tł'éé replied. "My grandfather's time. The mesa will look different when it passes. Will the cabin survive?" Tł'éé's hand found hers in the darkness, the first such contact between them. His palm was rough with calluses that matched her own. "We built it strong," he said simply. "Together. That single word contained multitudes, together, not as white settler and Apache scout, not as woman and man from opposing worlds, but as partners who had combined their knowledge and strength to create something neither could have built alone. They sat in silence after that, hands still joined, listening to the storm's fury and the strange, haunting music of the clay tiles that sang to the wind. Outside, the world was being reshaped by elemental forces, but within the cabin's walls, something equally profound was transforming. Something neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed on this seemingly barren mesa. Dawn revealed a transformed landscape. Trees lay uprooted, streams had changed course, and the familiar trail to the valley was now blocked by massive boulders dislodged from the mesa's edge. The storm had rewritten the terrain overnight, just as Tł'éé had predicted, but their cabin stood battered yet unbroken. "Your singing tiles worked," Sarah said, surveying the minimal damage to their roof, while all around them lay destruction. Tł'éé allowed himself a small smile. "Not just tiles, good building." He placed his hand on a roof beam. "Your strong bones, my flexible sinew." They were clearing debris from around the cabin when Sarah froze, her hand gripping Tł'éé's arm in warning. In the distance, dust rose from the newly cleared path that the storm had created up the mesa's western slope. "Riders," she said quietly. Tł'éé nodded, his expression turning grave. "Many, at least 6. "Price," Sarah guessed, her stomach tightening with dread. "Inside," Tł'éé directed. "I will meet them." "No," Sarah countered firmly. "This is my land. We'll face them together." As the riders approached, Sarah recognized Emmett Price at the lead, followed by Judge Hammond himself, and 4 men she didn't know, rough-looking characters whose hands rested too casually on their holstered weapons. "Miss Holloway," Judge Hammond called out with false cordiality, "glad to see you survived the tempest. Quite a remarkable little dwelling you've constructed." His gaze moved dismissively over the cabin before fixing coldly on Tł'éé. "I see your savage friend is still about." Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Tł'éé, though he remained alert and steady beside her. "What brings you gentlemen up the mesa after such a storm? Surely not concern for my welfare." Price dismounted, his boots squelching in the mud. "Actually, Miss Holloway, we've come on official business." He produced a document with an official territorial seal. "There appears to be some confusion about your claim to this property." Judge Hammond remained mounted, looking down from his horse with the same condescending expression he'd worn when denying her claim to her father's land. "It seems," he said with exaggerated patience, "that the survey boundaries of your father's original claim excluded this mesa for good reason. Recent geological assessments suggest mineral deposits of significant value." "Convenient timing," Sarah replied coldly. "Finding value in worthless land only after I've proven it can be developed." One of the unknown men spat tobacco juice near her feet. "Ain't proper for a white woman to take up with an Injun anyhow. Territorial laws clear on miscegenation." Sarah felt her face flush with anger, but before she could respond, Tł'éé spoke, his English deliberate and precise. "This woman claimed no man's land, built with her hands when no one would help." His calm voice carried authority that made even the armed men pause. "Now suddenly land has value? Convenient indeed." Judge Hammond's face darkened. "You'd do well to mind your place, boy. We're being generous, allowing you to leave peacefully, considering the Apache troubles." "What troubles?" Sarah demanded. "The ones you've invented to drive him away." Price stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable, Miss Holloway. The territorial governor has authorized a proper survey of these lands. You have no legal standing. Here, just a squatter with delusions." "I filed my claim legally," Sarah insisted. "The land office has my paperwork." "Paperwork can be misplaced," Judge Hammond said with a shrug, "especially during office relocations." The threat was unmistakable. Sarah felt a familiar sinking sensation. the same helplessness she'd experienced when they'd stolen her father's valley property through legal manipulation. One of the men moved toward Tł'éé, hand hovering near his pistol. "Time for your redskin. Friend to go, ma'am, unless he wants to explain to the cavalry patrol why he's so far from the reservation." Sarah's thoughts raced to her father's rifle hidden beneath the floorboards inside. She had never fired it at a person and prayed she never would, but these men were leaving few options. Tł'éé remained perfectly still, his dignity in stark contrast to the men's crude threats. His eyes met Sarah's briefly, communicating a silent warning. "This is not the moment for confrontation. You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate," Judge Hammond announced, turning his horse. "After that, we'll consider you trespassers, both of you, and act accordingly." As the men rode away, Sarah's hands trembled with fury and fear. "They can't do this. Not again." Tł'éé's expression was solemn, but not defeated. "They have papers and guns, but we have something they do not." "What's that?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Truth," he replied, "and soon allies." The visitors arrived at dusk, moving so silently that Sarah wouldn't have noticed them if Tł'éé hadn't touched her arm in quiet alert. 3 Apache men on horseback approached from the eastern ridge, a direction she would have thought impassable before the storm carved new paths through the landscape. "Tribal council," Tł'éé murmured, straightening his posture and stepping forward to greet them. The leader, an elder with deeply lined features and silver-streaked hair, carried an intricately carved wooden staff adorned with eagle feathers, a talking stick that marked him as a person of authority. He surveyed the cabin with keen interest before dismounting in a smooth motion that belied his age. Words flowed between Tł'éé and the visitors in their native tongue, too rapid for Sarah to catch the few phrases she had learned. She stood respectfully aside, aware of being evaluated by the newcomer's careful gazes. After several minutes, Tł'éé turned to her. "Sarah, this is Bitse, elder of Medicine Council, Nantai, war leader, and Distse, keeper of tribal history." Sarah inclined her head in greeting. "You are welcome to my home." Bitse studied her thoughtfully before speaking in accented but clear English. "This dwelling, interesting. Not Apache, not white settler. Something new. We built it together," Sarah explained, "using knowledge from both our traditions." The elder nodded, his expression revealing nothing. "Tł'éé was sent to watch boundaries. Instead, he builds with white woman." His tone wasn't accusatory, merely stating facts. "The storm has changed many boundaries," Sarah offered carefully. A flicker of approval crossed Bitse's weathered face. "You understand more than most white settlers." Tł'éé invited the elders inside the cabin, where Sarah had prepared a simple meal. The formality of their interaction gradually eased as they shared food, though an undercurrent of seriousness remained. "Tł'éé tells us soldiers come soon to move our people north," Nantai said, his scarred face hardening. "And that men from Valley want this place now." Sarah nodded. "Judge Hammond claims there are minerals in the mesa. He wants to take my claim, just as he took my father's Valley property." "White man's papers," Distse commented, shaking his head. "Always changing to suit white man's desires." "Tł'éé has been gone from his duties many days," Bitse said, addressing Sarah directly. "This concerns the council. He is valuable scout, important to our people's safety." Sarah felt a cold weight in her stomach. Of course they would want him to return. His prolonged absence to help her had diverted him from his responsibilities. "To his tribe, I understand," she said quietly. "I'm grateful for the help he's given me." Tł'éé spoke then, his words measured and respectful, but firm. He gestured to the cabin around them, to the map of the mesa he had drawn for Sarah, to the unique roof beams they had created together. When he finished, Bitse turned to Sarah. "Tł'éé believes something important happens here, not just cabin building." He studied her intently. "He says you treat land with respect, that you understand belonging to place, not owning it." "I'm learning," Sarah admitted. "My views have changed since coming here." Nantai remained skeptical. One white woman thinks differently. What good does this do our people when soldiers force us north, when settlers take more land? Perhaps much good, Bitsy replied thoughtfully. He turned to Sarah again. If you could speak to your people about Apache ways, would they listen? The question caught her off guard. Some might, not all. Probably not many, she answered honestly. And if Apache spoke to white settlers about respecting white woman's claim, would that help you? Sarah considered this unexpected offer. It might, though some would see it as proof of their fears. Bitsy nodded, seemingly satisfied with her candor. He spoke rapidly to the other elders in their language, a serious discussion that Tł'éé occasionally joined. Finally, Bitsy lifted the talking stick, indicating a decision had been reached. We will consider new path, not war path, not surrender path, something between. He fixed Sarah with a penetrating gaze. But first, we must know if white woman will stand with Apache people when soldiers come, same as Apache man stood with her when storm came. The question hung in the air, a test, a threshold, a moment of truth. Sarah felt the weight of history between their peoples, the violence and misunderstanding, the broken promises on both sides. I will, she said firmly, meeting each elder's eyes in turn. As Tł'éé has stood by me, I will stand by your people. Bitsy nodded slowly, then handed the talking stick to Tł'éé, a gesture whose significance wasn't lost on anyone present. We have until dawn, Tł'éé said as the elders departed, carrying word back to their people. Then Hammond and his men will return, expecting us gone. Sarah stood in the cabin doorway, watching the last crimson streaks of sunset fade from the sky. What exactly did Bitsy mean about a new path? My people have old agreements with territorial government, boundaries drawn before you or I were. Aborn. Tł'éé's expression was thoughtful as he examined the talking stick the elder had left in his care. Bitsy keeps these records. If Hammond's claim violates those boundaries, do you think it might? Possible. The mesa has always been between worlds, not fully claimed by either side. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant rumble of hooves, not from the direction of the valley, but from the eastern slope, where the Apache elders had just departed. More visitors? Sarah asked, alarmed. Tł'éé shook his head, listening intently. No, my sister's son, Key, fast rider. Minutes later, a young Apache man appeared, dismounting gracefully from a dappled pony. He spoke urgently to Tł'éé, casting curious glances at Sarah and the cabin. Cavalry patrol, Tł'éé translated grimly, moving earlier than expected. We'll reach Apache winter camp by midday tomorrow. And Hammond knows this, Sarah surmised. That's why he gave us until sundown. He expects the soldiers to do his dirty work for him. Tł'éé nodded, already moving with newfound urgency. We must finish the cabin tonight, complete it before they come. Finish it? Why? If they're going to force us off. A completed dwelling has meaning, Tł'éé explained, gathering tools. In both your law and Apache tradition, unfinished, it is just materials. Completed, it is home, has protection. Sarah didn't fully understand, but trusted his judgment. Together with Key, they began a night of intense labor. The carved door, the final major element of their structure, had been shaped but not hung. Now they worked to fit it properly, sanding and adjusting by torchlight. The door was unlike anything in the valley settlements below. Its surface featured intertwined carvings that Sarah and Tł'éé had designed together during quiet evenings. A blend of Apache spiritual symbols and the practical patterns her father had taught her. Here, Tł'éé guided her hands as they worked on the final decorative elements. Eagle for protection, mountain for strength. Sarah added her own touches. A compass rose, stars for navigation, flowing water symbols borrowed from Tł'éé's culture but rendered in her father's whittling style. What does this one mean? Key asked, pointing to a symbol near the door's center. Two paths becoming one, Tł'éé explained. Sarah's design. As the night deepened, their work took on an almost ceremonial quality. Tł'éé sang softly in his language, building songs, protection chants, while Sarah worked the wooden hinges she'd fashioned from seasoned oak. Near midnight, they hung the door, testing its swing. It fit perfectly, completing the cabin's transformation from shelter to home. "Now," Tł'éé said, producing a small pouch of red ochre, "final marks." He mixed the ochre with pine resin to form a deep red paint, then dipped his fingertips into it. With careful precision, he painted symbols above the door frame, protective signs that Sarah had seen on Apache dwellings when Tł'éé had taken her to observe his people's camps from a distance. "Your turn," he said, offering her the paint. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know the proper symbols." "Use your heart's knowledge," he replied. "Cabin is both Apache and settler, needs both voices." Moved by his words, Sarah dipped her fingers into the ochre mixture and, beside his symbols, painted her father's initials and the date, the same mark he had placed above the door of every home he'd built. When they finished, the three of them stood back to observe their completed work. The cabin seemed to glow with inner light in the torch's flickering illumination, a structure born of two worlds, yet belonging fully to neither. "Something new, as Bitsy had observed. It is good," Tł'éé said simply. He nodded in agreement. "Strong dwelling, good medicine." Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over her. Whatever happened tomorrow, they had created something meaningful, something that would stand as testimony to what was possible when different traditions worked in harmony rather than opposition. "Now," Tł'éé said, his voice turning practical again, "we prepare for morning. Key will take message. To Bitsy, we will welcome our uninvited guests." "Both kinds," Sarah added grimly, thinking of Hammond's men and the cavalry patrol. Tł'éé's hand found hers briefly in the darkness. "Both kinds," he agreed. "Together." They came at dawn, just as the first golden light spilled across the mesa. Two groups approaching from different directions, Judge Hammond and his men from the western slope, a cavalry patrol led by Lieutenant Blackwood from the south. Sarah and Tł'éé stood side by side before their completed cabin, watching. The riders converge on their small clearing. Neither spoke, but their shoulders nearly touched, a silent affirmation of their shared resolve. "Appears we have company," Lieutenant Blackwood remarked dryly, as his patrol reached the cabin simultaneous with Hammond's group. "Perfect timing." "Lieutenant," Hammond replied with forced joviality, "we're here on official territorial business. This woman is squatting illegally, and her Apache friend is outside reservation boundaries." Blackwood's gaze swept over the cabin with professional assessment, noting the unusual construction and the freshly painted symbols above the door. His eyes lingered on Sarah and Tł'éé's united stance before returning to Hammond. "That's so?" he asked mildly. "Miss Holloway seemed quite certain of her claim when we spoke in town." "Paperwork irregularities," Price interjected smoothly. "Unfortunate, but clear. The Territorial Office has authorized resurvey of these lands." As the men postured, movement at the eastern ridge caught Sarah's attention. The Apache elders had returned, accompanied by several others, including a white man in civilian clothes whom Sarah didn't recognize. Lieutenant Blackwood noticed them too, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before he registered that the approaching party showed no signs of hostility. "What's the meaning of this?" Hammond demanded, as the newcomers joined the gathering. Bitsy stepped forward, his bearing regal despite the tension of the moment. Beside him, the unknown white man spoke. "Thomas Wilson, Territorial Indian Affairs Office." He introduced himself with a curt nod. "These gentlemen have brought a matter of some interest to my attention." He produced a leather portfolio and extracted a weathered document. "This appears to be a treaty map from 1851, duly signed by territorial representatives and Apache leaders. It clearly establishes this mesa as neutral ground, specifically excluded from settlement claims due to its traditional importance to local tribes." Hammond's face reddened. That's absurd. Ancient paperwork has no bearing on current territorial development. On the contrary, Wilson countered coolly, the treaty was never superseded or amended. Legally speaking, it remains in force. Lieutenant Blackwood studied the document with interest. This appears to be properly executed, Judge Hammond, and it would explain why this land was excluded from original settlement surveys. My father's claim explicitly excluded this mesa, Sarah added, finding her voice. That's why I came here. It was the only land not already claimed by others. By happy coincidence, Wilson continued, placing you squarely on neutral ground, Miss Holloway. Ground that, according to this treaty, cannot be claimed by either settlers or tribes, but might be used by both with mutual respect. Hammond spluttered in protest, but Price placed a restraining hand on his uncle's arm, recognizing the shifting dynamics. There's still the matter of the Apache man living outside reservation boundaries, one of Hammond's companions insisted. Tł'éé serves as designated boundary scout, Bitse explained in his accented English. Treaty allows such movement for specific purposes. And his purpose here? Lieutenant Blackwood inquired, gesturing toward the cabin. Cultural exchange. Wilson supplied with the ghost of a smile, quite in keeping with the territorial governor's recent directives on improved relations with peaceful tribes. A tense silence fell as Hammond's group realized their carefully constructed plan was unraveling. The judge himself finally broke it, his voice brittle with barely controlled rage. This isn't over. There are procedures, reviews, which can be pursued through proper channels. Blackwood interrupted smoothly. For now, it appears Miss Holloway has legitimate presence here, as does Scout Tł'éé. His tone left little room for argument. As Hammond and his men reluctantly departed, followed more slowly by the cavalry patrol, Wilson approached Sarah and Tł'éé with the treaty document in hand. This is rather unprecedented, he admitted quietly. A white woman and an Apache scout building a dwelling together on neutral ground. He studied their unique cabin with genuine curiosity. Some might see it as a problem. Others might see possibility. What do you see? Sarah asked. Wilson considered this. I see a potential bridge between worlds that rarely communicate except through violence. He carefully unfolded the treaty map further. This document does more than protect your claim. Miss Holloway, it creates a unique legal status for this place, neither fully territorial land nor tribal land. Tł'éé spoke then, his words measured. New path for both peoples. Precisely, Wilson agreed. Though not everyone will appreciate such innovation. Sarah glanced at Tł'éé, then back to Wilson. What happens now? That, Wilson said, handing the treaty document to them both, is largely up to you. Spring came to the mesa in subtle waves. First the greening of scrub pines, then wildflowers dotting the rocky soil, finally warm breezes replacing winter's bitter winds. The cabin stood as it had through the winter storms, its unique construction proving remarkably resilient to both weather and scrutiny. Sarah sat on the porch she and Tł'éé had added during the milder days of late winter, watching approach of visitors with a calm that would have been unimaginable months earlier. These days, visitors were no longer a cause for alarm, but an increasingly common occurrence. More coming, Tł'éé observed, joining her on the bench they'd carved together. Third group this week. Sarah nodded, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Two families in wagons made their way up the improved trail to the mesa. Settlers by their dress and conveyance, but moving with the respectful deliberation that had become expected of those seeking what the cabin offered. Word travels, she remarked, rising to prepare for their guests. In the 6 months since the confrontation with Hammond and the revelation of the treaty, their cabin had evolved from personal dwelling to something more complex. Wilson's prediction of possibility had manifested in unexpected ways. It began with curiosity. Apache families cautiously visiting to observe the strange hybrid dwelling built by Tł'éé and the white woman. then settlers from distant homesteads, drawn by rumors of ingenious construction techniques adapted to the harsh environment. Both groups initially kept distance from each other, but the cabin itself became neutral ground where knowledge could be exchanged without immediate threat. Trading post, Bitsy had suggested during a winter visit, place where more than goods can be traded. Ideas also. The suggestion took root. With spring's arrival, they had expanded the cabin to include a covered area where visitors could gather, bringing their knowledge, their needs, and eventually their trust. Sarah greeted the approaching settlers, while Tł'éé prepared coffee, a ritual they had developed for new arrivals. "We heard you might have roof designs that withstand mountain winds," the lead settler explained after introductions. "Lost half our shingles in the last storm, and we were told there might be—" The man's wife hesitated, lowering her voice. "An Apache healer who knows about the fever sickness affecting children in the valley. Tł'éé's sister visits tomorrow," Sarah confirmed. "She has knowledge of the fever plant that grows on the north slope." While Sarah discussed roofing techniques with the settlers, Tł'éé guided their children to the threshold stone set before the cabin's entrance. The large, flat rock bore 2 handprints pressed into the clay surface before it had been fired, one larger, one smaller, side by side. "When we finished the cabin," he explained to the wide-eyed children, "we marked it as belonging to both worlds, not just one person's home, a place of meeting." The children placed their own small hands within the impressions, a ritual that had spontaneously developed among visitors. Later, as evening approached and the settlers prepared to make camp nearby, Sarah and Tł'éé stood together at the edge of the mesa, looking out over the valley below. Judge Hammond filed another petition, Sarah mentioned, having received the news from Lieutenant Blackwood during his most recent patrol visit. Still trying to invalidate the treaty, Tł'éé seemed unconcerned. Paper fights paper. Meanwhile, real people find real solutions. She smiled at his pragmatism. "The territorial governor is actually considering Wilson's proposal, making this place an official trading post with special status. Good, more will come." Tł'éé's gaze moved to the distant mountains, where his people's summer camps would soon be established. "My mother asks if you will visit this season. Learn weaving." The invitation touched Sarah deeply. She had met Tł'éé's family during their winter visits, but traveling to their summer grounds represented a new level of acceptance. "I'd be honored," she replied. "Will you stay there?" It was the question that always hovered between them. How to balance their responsibilities to their respective communities with what they had built together. Tł'éé had resumed his scouting duties after the confrontation, though he returned regularly to the cabin that had become much more than either of them had initially envisioned. "I will come and go," he answered. "As will you. The cabin stands. Whether we are here or not." Sarah understood the deeper truth in his words. What they had created transcended their individual presence, a bridge between worlds that would remain even when they were elsewhere. As the sun set behind the distant peaks, they returned to the cabin, its windows glowing with welcoming light. Above the door, their combined symbols, Apache protection signs and her father's initials, had weathered the seasons, just as the unique structure they adorned. "We built something strong," Sarah said softly. Tł'éé nodded, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, "with our bare hands."